Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm Coach, mother of four, and potty talker, Ann Kaplan. This is the podcast where I confess something from my own parenting and coaching life, teach a lesson around it, and answer your questions. Even we parenting experts are far from perfect, and the real magic happens when we get down with all that imperfection. We get into the gritty side of parenting here, so earbud up and dive in.
Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the podcast. I'm excited to be here with you guys this week, talking about something that has come up a ton recently in my practice, which is what in the hell is going on inside teen and tween brains. I had a consultation last week with a couple who, for really intense circumstances that I'm not going to go into right now, has gone from having no teenagers to now parenting a 16-year-old overnight. And watching and listening to them in that consultation was just such a reminder of how bonkers adolescence is and how crazy making it can be to parent an adolescent. Um, can you imagine just being sort of like thrown into the deep end of the pool like that and trying to figure out how to navigate this chapter of parenthood? It's a lot. It's my heart goes out to this couple, and also just my hat goes off to them. Like, holy mackerel, amazing, incredible, very inspirational. But also, I mean, just mystifying, maddening, confusing, hilarious sometimes. I mean, I think anybody who has dealt with a teen, a tween, um, has probably in the same day pulled their hair out, just shaken their head in confusion, and also tried to stifle laughter while this child is behaving completely ridiculously. That is the experience of parenting a teen. Let's talk about what the experience is of being a teen. Like, what is going on inside these kiddos? And I'm going to be talking about teenagers today. Just know that it doesn't really matter if the word teen is in your child's age. Kids start going through this period of transition and change as early as 9 years old. And in fact, if you are on my email list, you received an email several weeks ago about something called the 9 year change. This is this very pivotal moment in child development that happens around 9 years old, that really kicks off this sort of progression that then we are riding this roller coaster until our kids are like, listen, adolescence isn't completely over until like mid to late 20s. Okay. So you think about that. Like, I remember even before I became a coach and learned about these things officially, I remember looking back on my early years as a wife and a mother thinking like I was a glorified teenager. Like, I did not know who I was or what I was doing or how to not be a petulant child with my mother, with my in-laws, like any of those things. I maybe didn't say teen after my age anymore, but like, I met my husband when I was 21 years old. We were pregnant before our first anniversary. Like, you know, I would say I had no business raising children, but I did it. And that's what happened to me. And many people do. It's not like you wait until you're 28 to have kids, or you take a test at the doctor that says your brain is finally out of adolescence and now you can get married. No, life just happens. But I definitely was a little bit of a mess in those early years because I was basically still a teenager, even though I technically wasn't. So when you hear me say teen during the episode, just know that it actually has nothing to do with chronology. And if you don't have a kiddo who's 9 or older, just I would encourage you to still listen to this episode. I think there's going to be some really important little pieces of information for you. And also, it's a little bit of a precursor to what's coming, so you can be ready. Um, I have so many confessions for you this week that instead of starting us off with a confession, I'm just going to pepper them into the topics that I'm talking about. It's going to come off more as like just stories about my life than confessions, but just know that these are big, deep reveals in terms of my own like comfort with sharing some of this stuff. So, when we talk about teenagers, well, actually, I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm not going to go too far into that 9 year change piece, but just to know that adolescence is a continuation of this process that starts around that 9-year change. It's this moment, this realization that we have that we are separate from the world around us, that we are individual. We have an identity apart from the other individuals in our lives, and that everybody's an individual. Um, if you want to know more about that 9-year change, I highly recommend getting on my email list because that's the kind of stuff that I send out. And I like to encourage you, if you're just listening to the podcast and you're just learning about me, to take advantage of all of these great resources that are available to you. Getting on my email list is something that's free, and it will help you get these tidbits every week about parenting and things like that. So if you want to go deeper into that, I encourage you to join the email list. But suffice it to say that starting around age 9, kids really have that sort of realization. And that realization kicks off this period of extremely rapid and strong ego development in them that continues, like I said. I mean, ego development, especially, and I would say ego sort of like solidification continues almost until your mid 30s, when you have like an identity crisis. And if you choose to explore and engage in self-help work or self-growth work, you are going to start systematically dismantling your ego for the rest of your life. This ego that you worked so hard to create. Oh man. But that's what adolescence is. And the more that kids get deeper and deeper into that period, the more that they do these things like comparing themselves to the world around them, wanting to have an individuality and assert their identity and create an identity for themselves, wanting to go off and become themselves and explore their lives and create a life for themselves and all of those things. So that's kind of the big picture of what's going on in the life of your child when they are in this like chapter, when they're a teenager. When I talk to my clients about the teen years, I really break it down into 3 specific things, because it's really helpful. That's just the way my brain works. I'm an Ania type 1. I like to take the big picture. I like to make order out of chaos and really boil it down for people. That's one of my superpowers when I'm coaching my clients, is that you can bring me your hot mess and just have verbal diarrhea, and I will make sense of it all for you. So I find it really helpful to look at adolescence through that window of let's look at the big takeaways, the big picture, and these like big kind of elements that are going inside our kids. And the first of those is something that I call, um, you know, lots of different things, but one of this idea, I call it worth it. And here's what I mean by that. Have you ever noticed, or if you haven't, think back to when you were a teenager, how comfortable with risk teenagers tend to be compared to adults, where they will just go off and do things that in our minds, it seems like absolutely not worth it. The risks outweigh the benefits. It's not worth the risk, whatever you want to say. Teenagers just don't think that way. And because they don't, I'm going to tell you how they do think. But it's very easy for parents to think my kid is either unaware of the risks of the choice they're making, or they don't care about the risks. Like the risks don't matter to them. And that's really not true. All people, including teenagers, do a cost plus analysis when they make decisions. They weigh, what are the pros? What are the cons? Do the risks outweigh the reward? All of that stuff. But what's happening inside a teenage brain is that their brains are wired to favor the benefits over the risk. So it's almost like someone's putting like a little finger on the scale in favor of benefits. So when they do that cost plus analysis, almost always the result of that cost plus analysis is worth it. It's worth it. It's worth it to smoke with my friends. It's worth it to, sneak out of the house. It's worth it to, get in this car with someone I know I shouldn't, all of those things. Worth it, worth it, worth it. That's the result of almost all of those sort of like weighing things that happen in our kids' heads. Like, this is why kids feel invincible, because their brains are really focusing on the opportunities. Their brains focus on opportunity and possibility, and they don't spend too much time thinking about the downside of things. And I definitely know for myself, like was totally, in this invincible mindset when I was a kid. And I'm not a super big risk taker. I'm a pretty compliant and responsible kiddo, but I'll tell you, here's confession number one for you. The most risky thing that I can think of right now, at least off the top of my head, that I did was uh back in high school, driving around with my friends in the middle of winter, snowy winter. This boy that I had a crush on worked at the local ski hill, and I do mean hill because I was living in Michigan. Um, he worked at the local ski hill, and also, he smoked weed and all the stuff. And I totally had a huge crush on him. And we were just like hitting it off at this party. We had already smoked. And I was like, oh, I love skiing. I haven't been to the ski hill since we moved to Michigan, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, well, let's go right now. And I totally went skiing with him, stoned, and I totally, shouldn't have been skiing. I fell, which isn't that big of a deal, except when I fell, I had my poles in my hands and I whacked my temple on the top of one of my poles when I fell. And I know for sure that I gave myself a concussion. It was minor. It was fine. If my parents ever listen to this podcast, which I highly doubt, there you go. That's a reveal for them. And and I never told them and all that stuff. Like, I would do that now. That was a super stupid risk that I took because I wanted to be cool, because I wanted this boy to like me, because, I wanted to be like, game for anything and have fun. And so the whole like, oh, but skiing when you're stoned, maybe that won't work out for you, and you don't even have your ski gear with you, and blah 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 blah, didn't cross my mind. So, and actually, what I should say is it did cross my mind. And I immediately was like, yep, those things are all true. And look at how worth it is. So I did it. So that's a great example of that whole like cost plus analysis thing that's going on inside our kids' brains. That second thing that I talk about with my clients is this idea of instant gratification. So I like to talk about this right after I talk about the risk reward thing, because I talk to clients all of the time who are like, I found a vape pen in my kid's backpack, and I've already talked to him about, the risks of popcorn lung and nicotine addiction and how their brains are still developing, so they shouldn't use substances. And, I found this vape, and we sat down, we had this long talk again, but I keep finding vape pens in his backpack. And it's like, the question I always ask them is it your hypothesis that the reason your child is vaping is because they don't know about the risks of vaping? And usually there's this kind of look on their face of realization of like, oh, right. They already know. Like, knowing isn't the missing link for this kiddo. It's just not. And that is the perfect juxtaposition of this cost plus situation that's going on in their mind, um that like risk reward skewing that's happening in their mind, and this instant gratification thing that's happening in their mind. Getting popcorn lung is something that's going to happen maybe a year or two or 10 from now. Getting lung cancer is something that could happen to me when I'm 70. That is like nothing to a teenager. Teenagers do not have access to the part of their brain that thinks about the big picture and the long view. They start to re-access it usually in sort of late teenage times, like maybe as they're maybe getting to be like a senior in high school or later. But in the beginning, especially, like this whole like someday this might happen to you, it's not a deterrent. Your kid's already wired to outweigh that risk with the possibility and the opportunity and the potential positives. Plus, that risk is something that is very, very long term. And this is why doing things like grounding a kid for life or for a month or taking away their phone for 6 weeks or whatever rarely helps change children's behavior, because a month or 6 weeks or a year is an eternity to a child who is in this chapter of their life. It's so big that it's never and forever at the same time. And so there's really not a whole lot of incentive for them to make better choices. They're not, the reward that they're going to get is like never, it's never going to happen. So why bother? Um, Also, this is one reason why these like more extreme consequences for kids, like where it's like you can have your phone back after you've cleaned your room, written a letter to your grandma, gotten your grades up and taken your brother out for ice cream. That's way too many things. It's once again, there's no chance for like this sort of like immediate win for them. It's like, well, forget it. I'll never measure up. There's no incentive for me to try. So that's that whole like immediate instant gratification piece that is just really, really hard for adults who have matured to the point where they're thinking about retirement and planning for the future and things like health insurance and what if this and just in case. Like our brains do not work the way that a teenager does. That's why we spend our time pulling our hair out and being completely mystified by them. Like it's a completely different way of relating to the world. And the third thing that we talk about when we talk about teenagers is this amazing ability they have to make themselves innocent no matter how badly they've messed up. And the example I have for this, and I know my sister actually does listen to this podcast. So I'm going to shout out to my sister Ren because this story involves her. So when Ren was 16, she came to live with me in Boulder and we had so much fun and it was so cool. She got like a job at ice cream shop. She had a boyfriend. We taught her how to drive a stick shift. It was so awesome. But also, like, I'm an Ania type 1, so I'm very responsible and like on my game. And I took it really seriously that for the summer, like, I was the grown up. Like, if something happened to her, I was responsible. I needed to be able to, take her to the hospital if got in trouble or, something like that. Like, we had set up like power of attorney so that I could, execute things just in case of an emergency and all this stuff. This is the brain of a 1, everybody, in case you are still curious about your neotype. This is one of the things that happens inside the brain of a 1. So the other thing I did when Ren came out there was like, okay, well, I should probably be able to like know what's going on with her and keep track of what's happening and stuff like that. So we went out for coffee and I asked her, like, listen, I'm supposed to be in charge or whatever. So what curfew do you think is a good idea? What time? And she picked midnight. And then I asked her, okay, so cool. And just, let's let me know where you're at. And what do you think should happen if, if you don't follow the curfew? Like, what do you want me to do or whatever? And she's like, I don't know, I guess call mom. And I'm like, sounds good. Great. Midnight. Let me know where you're at. Call mom if it doesn't work out. That was the plan. And, sure enough, she's a 16-year-old. She didn't tell me where she was and she didn't come home at midnight. And I was like, talk to her about it the next day. Like, dude, come on. We made these, actually, you made this arrangement. Just do it, which, any parent out there should know didn't work. Like, she did it again. And we had a blowout fight. And the entire time I was just completely beside myself of like, I don't get it. Like, this was your rule that you set for yourself and we had this agreement um and yet you're mad at me. And she was totally furious with me for, I'm not exactly sure what. Even Ren, maybe you'll tell me after you listen to this podcast if we're still friends. um but to my mind it was like, how can you not see that this is your fault? Like, how can you not take responsibility for this situation? Obviously I didn't know my ass from my elbow about teen brains or teenagers or I wasn't even in this career yet, so I had no clue. And I just was completely mystified at how somebody could show up in that conversation like completely innocent, like they were the victim and I was the one who was being mean and there was no culpability or responsibility. But that is the brain of a teenager. And this ego development that they're in, where they are recognizing that they are separate from the world around them, that they are an individual and the world around them is separate from them, it they start to see this inner thing and this external thing, an inner world and an outer world. And it's almost like it's like overload. It's like it's like having an ego but on steroids, or it's like having an individuality but on steroids, or it's like being able to externalize things but times a million. Teenagers are magically capable of externalizing. And what I mean by that is they see this world around them as this thing that is to blame for the situation that they are in. They are able to maintain that separation of themselves from the world around them by almost like contorting or even being in a denial state that maintains this sort of like illusion that I'm good, I'm cool, I'm innocent, I'm me. And the stuff that's around me is actually, it doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm not to blame for it. It's not a result of my behavior. It's just happening. And it may be happening to me, but it's certainly not because I have a part to play in it. And that externalizing is super frustrating for parents. This is when I have conversations with parents about how entitled their children are, how like irrational they are. Um, but you have to understand that teenagers are master externalizers because their ego is exploding and constantly emphasizing how separate they are from the world around them. And that over focus, that extra focus on external circumstances can lead to defensiveness, the denial that I mentioned, and also anxiety. And I'll talk about that in a second. When kids are confronted with their culpability or their inconsistency, their hypocrisy, their any sort of like uh contradiction, and it's because their ego is exploding. It's also because their ego is new and fragile. And looking too closely at mistakes or shortcomings or ourselves can be really threatening to that budding, fragile ego. So it doesn't work to sort of we all think I'm going to just lay it out for you point by point. This, then this, then this. Here are the facts of the case. Therefore, it is very clear and irrefutable that you broke curfew. And so I'm going to call mom. Or therefore, it is irrefutable that, you lose access to your car, or, and it doesn't matter that you had the prior agreement. It doesn't matter that it's irrefutable. It doesn't matter. It does not matter, because what you're doing when you're having that conversation with the teenager is literally threatening their identity, this fragile new identity that they've created that's too fragile to be flawed. It's too fragile for them to look at in a sort of confronting way. When we're in our 30s and we have that identity crisis, and then we look at this house of cards that we've built and realize, oh, me blaming everybody else for my problems isn't working for me anymore. Or me seeing the world as black and white isn't working for me anymore. Or me, trying to please everybody isn't working for me anymore. We can do that confrontation with ourselves and start to dismantle that, because that identity that we've created is strong enough to withstand our confrontation, if that makes sense. When we're little and our ego is this like half-formed thing, that confrontation it's so jarring that it's intolerable. It's excruciating. And so what we see with our kids when we do confront them in this way is a doubling down, a retreat into even more ego strategies that will protect us from pain. And I was wrong in that situation with my sister. Like, of course, I had no idea. For me, I was looking at it as an adult who was just going to, like, XYZ, this plus this plus this equals that. But what I was actually doing was really, I would say almost like aggressive to the point of hurtful, because I didn't understand that by me approaching her that way, I was attacking her self with a capital S that she was still creating. And so these understandings about what's going on in our kids' brains become so important, because Otherwise, we do what I did to my sister, or we do what parents do all the time, ground our kids for life and take away their phone for a year or whatever. Like these ineffective parenting strategies that have two detriments. The first is it doesn't change their behavior. So it doesn't, in fact, it usually just makes them double down on their poor behavior. So we're not actually disciplining them in a way that's effective. But the second, and I would posit even worse and more damaging impact of us parenting that way, is that we are driving a wedge between ourselves and our children at a time when maintaining our connection with them is so crucially important. So these are the things that are going inside of our kids' brains. And once we know that, we can understand, like, okay, great, I need to give my kid a consequence that matters to them because risk doesn't matter to them. I need to give my kid an ability for restoration that's really easily graspable so they can have a quick and satisfying win and stay with that momentum. I need to have a conversation with my kid that's much more about agree to disagree or seeing it in two different ways versus I need to win and prove that you're wrong. Oh my gosh. Now I can actually still hold boundaries with my kid. Now I can actually discipline my child. Now I can actually help my kid make great choices and I don't have to worry about losing them. That's what this knowledge gives us. And it's really, really powerful. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with around teenagers is this answer to a question I get all the time after I outline these three elements of it, which is like, why? Why? Oh, why would nature make our children this whacked out? They are so selfish. They're so impulsive. They are going crazy and taking risks and putting themselves in danger. And like, why? Why? What is the purpose of this? But without these things going on in their brains, without our kids being selfish, impulsive, cocky, volatile, emotional, all of those things, our kids also wouldn't have courage, self belief, trust, adaptability, and stamina, these things that they really need to go out into the world and become grown ups. Because when you really think about what is about to happen to our teenagers, it's kind of mind blowing. Like these teenagers who don't know anything, let's be honest, and have never taken care of themselves, do not have an identity apart from their relationship with their parents yet. They're not even a full-fledged human. They're like a proto adult. They are about to leave our homes, go out into the world, assert themselves, find a path, pick a career, choose a major, live on their own, and just confront the world. And they're going to kick ass at it. And it's going to be messy and all of those things. It's not going to be perfect, but they're going to do it. Do you understand the fucking uh bravery and courage that is required for a child to go out and do that? The arrogance and self-belief and trust that it's all going to work out that they need to have. Otherwise, kids would never leave their parents' homes and the human race just wouldn't work. Kids have to go through this period of just like wide-eyed optimism and go for it energy so that they can launch. And when you think about what's going on in a kid's brain from that perspective, it's kind of beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. And it is funny and it is confusing and it is just, I don't know. For me, sitting back and watching my teenagers most of the time, it's just like, most of the time, I'm just like, damn, you are so different from me. Like you are seeing the world through a completely different lens that's unavailable to me anymore. I'm 45. Like that time of my life is over. And I remember it and I miss it. I'm also glad I'm not in it anymore, all of that stuff. But like the window of that, like go out and conquer new worlds vibe, like it closes. And kids need that window to be open so that they can launch. If this is resonating with you, if you are like having so many more follow-up questions, I know I mentioned anxiety and, what does it look like for an anxious kid to have all these three things? Like that's another topic for another podcast. But if you are in this place of like curiosity, a million follow-up questions, excitement about how you could be feeling in your relationship with your teenager, with this just like amazement and impressive admiration and all of that stuff, set up that free discovery call you hear me talk about every week. It is here for you, just waiting for you to click on that button and make it happen for yourself. And I can't wait to talk to you about this stuff. It is beautiful and exciting and also hard and overwhelming. It's all of the things. Have a great week, everybody. I will talk to you again soon. And I can't wait to see your discovery call pop up in my calendar. Bye, everyone.
The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/KaplanCall, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.